Hello. So this week we are looking at Downie's response, his criticism of Sieghart, and there are particular points that he makes against Sieghart, but one gets the feeling that overall he just doesn't buy the whole notion of a profession as being something that is a legitimately distinct sort of thing from other jobs, and that as a result, I suppose he does not accept the notion that there's anything like professional ethics. So we get an entirely different point of view. I mean, the whole notion of a profession, that is, that the category profession is of any use, ethically or otherwise, is really up in the air here. There's, again, there are particular points here that Downie interrogates Sieghart on. One of which is I suppose, a empirical point of fact, and that is whether so-called professionals, I guess we have to qualify it, so-called professionals actually in the real world act any differently or any better, any more ethically, any more altruistically than anyone else. And his answer to that is clearly no. But that's not really the main point, I think. The Sieghart couldn't have been making the claim that in the real world, professionals do, in fact, act according to professional ethics or act more altruistically or consider themselves more in service. That he may believe that, but he couldn't argue that because it would take too much argument and evidence, really. The point is really a conceptual one, moral one, not whether professionals do, in fact, behave a certain way, but whether they should. That is, in morality, as Kant said, morality is not about the way the world is. Morality is about the way the world should be. So morality is not about the way people behave. Morality is about the way people should behave, whether they do or not. So I suppose the key question here is not whether professionals, lawyers, doctors, engineers, priests, military people, whoever we decide to include in that, whether they do in fact act a certain way, but whether they should. And if they should, what is it based upon? And here Downie attacks Sieghart on two key points in Sieghart. The one is the idea that professional ethics is based upon the inequality of power between the person providing the service, the professional, whether it be patient, client, whatever, and whether the person providing the service, whether it be engineer, doctor, lawyer, etc., and the person receiving the service, whether it be patient, client, or whatever. I mean, this disproportion of power, which seems to be key in Sieghart's argument. That is, that the imperative to act altruistically seems to spring in Sieghart from this disproportion of power. And the idea is that because professionals do have such lopsided relationships with those to whom they provide their services, and that is determined by their specialized knowledge and skills, that the opportunities for exploitation, for taking advantage of the other, are so ripe that one simply has to abide by an ethic of altruism. That is, never act in your own interest in relation to a client, always act in the client's interest. The second point that that Downie attacks Sieghart on is the whole idea of the noble cause. And it would seem to be these are really the two key points at issue between them. And let's face it, Downie makes some fair points against Sieghart. One, that this relationship of having the disproportion or the inequality of power exists in many, many fields that we feel no inclination to call professional fields. He mentions travel agents and car mechanics. That's a pretty good one. That is, that there are many relationships that we enter into, business relationships, say, where we are at the mercy of those who are providing the service because we simply don't know, enough to know whether they're providing us good service or not, or taking advantage of us. Which is a good point, because that would be the idea that, well, I mean, if you're using that as a criterion for being something being a profession, then perhaps many, many, many things are professions, and then the category loses all usefulness because it's applied too widely. The same goes for the notion of a noble cause. The idea in Sieghart that lawyers serve the noble cause of justice, that doctors serve the noble cause of promoting health, that any number of jobs could claim the noble cause status. Farmers, architects, teachers, policemen, furniture makers, underwear makers, I think is where he goes a little bit too far. But, that same idea that it's not a bad idea, the notion that there's a disproportionate power in many exchanges, business exchanges especially. It's not a bad idea that people may serve a noble cause in what they do beyond their own profit. But it's just that there's nothing distinctive about doctors, lawyers, engineers, priests, et cetera, that those characteristics are part of many jobs, many things that people do. Well, it's really up to you to decide. It's a question of judgment. I mean, my response to Downie would be: do you really think that there isn't something distinctive about what a doctor does or a lawyer does? That is, do you really think that the kind of things that doctors and lawyers do you think that they're not more crucial to people's well-being than the kind of things that other people do? That is, we could certainly attack the criterion as being too loose or being ambiguous, but we do have a feeling, and I think that Sieghart, in his response to Downie's response, which I've included, does sort of point that out. That is, that it may not be something we can come up with a rigorous definition of in terms of the professions and the unique status of the kind of things that they do, but there is a certain feeling and expectation, I think, on our part. That is, when we're dealing with a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, and maybe other things, we approach that relationship differently, and we have perhaps higher standards in terms of our assumptions about how that person will act in relation to us. Perhaps those assumptions are mistaken, and perhaps those expectations are oftentimes bound to be disappointed. But I can't help shake the feeling that he's got a point. That is, that we do believe that with regard to certain jobs, that the people who are performing them simply must rise to a higher level of moral behavior, especially a higher level of altruism. That is, if most people in most jobs do not have to answer the phone at 3 a.m. because what they do is just not that crucial. But a doctor or a lawyer has to answer the phone at 3 a.m. I mean, they don't always, but they're obligated to, because the person on the other line may have a need which simply needs to be addressed immediately. Not everybody does stuff like that. I don't do stuff like that. There's nothing I do that requires me to answer the phone at 3 a.m. But certainly engineers may be in such a situation. Now, of course, other jobs may be in such a situation too, and that's where the problem is. So I think that the really interesting conversation happens here between Sieghart and Downie, and crucial issues having to do with the professions, the whole idea of professional ethics, and certainly crucial to engineering ethics.